Good. So today we've got a very interesting person here on our session. Honourable Member Ghaleb Cachalia. He is the Shadow Minister of State-Owned Enterprises and an Indian, one of the many politicians in South Africa. But today we're not going to talk about your politics. We're going to talk about the Indian background, the Indians in South Africa. Because actually I found out that last year was exactly 160 years ago that the first indentured laborers came to South Africa. So it was a huge, huge influence on the South African culture that came in with those. But I want you to give us a little bit more background on why indentured laborers, where did they come from? So tell me some stories.
Well, the indentured laborers came largely from India. They were, at the time of the British Empire, allowed to travel within the British Empire. And obviously, people looked for opportunity, and the opportunity presented on two fronts. One was the opportunity that was presented to economically disadvantaged people who were struggling in their own countries and seeking a better life, took advantage of the indentured labor facility, which was created by Empire to allow Indians in particular to come and work on the sugar fields of Natal and earn they got free passage, and they could earn by working for a particular time. They could either earn the right to stay on and get a piece of land, or move or be sent back with their earnings back to their home country. And many did this, and many chose to stay. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning of indentured laborers. Then there was a following wave, which was soon thereafter of so-called passenger Indians who made their own arrangements to come to South Africa because of the opportunities that presented, largely as a result of the finding of diamonds and gold, which boomed the economy. And they came here, there being Indians here already who came as indentured. They came laborers. They came as passenger Indians to find their to make their fortunes. That was how my grandparents came to South Africa, as passenger Indians.
Okay, so indentured labor, what exactly was that? It was not slavery, was it?
Well, it was semi-slavery in that you were held captive of the place that you were allocated to work at. So if I was sent or allocated to work at, say, Tongaat Hulert's farm then I was effectively housed there. I was my barracks were there. I would work on the farm. There would be people who were appointed as overseers who would oversee indentured people who were appointed overseers to ensure that the workers did the work. They were provided rations if they didn't work to the satisfaction of the employers. Rations were cut. There were beatings that happened, and all sorts of the trials and tribulations of life that would occur in those circumstances. So while it wasn't 100% slavery, it was fairly close.
Sort of a modern day slavery maybe at that stage.
Yes.
So that was in 1860 that they came. So that was after the abolishment of slavery anyway. But
yes.
could they bring their families?
As far as I know, I don't know if they could bring their family, or they married here. They may well. I'm looking at the ship's list, for example, here in this book called Documents of Indentured Laborer, and on the ship's list of the of the Belvedere, which was one of the ships which arrived on the 26th of November 1860. It states here the name of the immigrant, the name of the father or mother, the age, the sex, the caste, the village they came from, and any marks on their body. So that's how they were accounted for.
Okay, that caste thing is quite interesting. That's not part of India today, is it?
Well, caste has been in India for thousands of years. It is discrimination on the grounds of caste is outlawed by the Indian Constitution. But as you know, you can outlaw things that people will still practice them.
Yeah, exactly. But that doesn't count for the South African Indians, does it?
No.
Okay, so we'll get back to later on to know how the Indian culture almost has changed since they are in South Africa, or since they've been in South Africa.
You see, I don't see any listing of marital status or anything of the sort here.
Okay,
I'm looking at the register who arrived on one of the early ships, the Truro, in 1857. It was name, father's name, age, sex, time when arrived, place from which arrived, amount of money that was advanced, to whom they were assigned, which farmer, the date of the assignment, what was paid as a proportion of expenses on that date, if they were transferred to whom and who was the transfer, and then some remarks. So the remarks were sort of things: returned to India, or license to go to the diamond fields, died in the barrack hospital, died on the island, and so on.
Mm-hmm. That's quite interesting, because I also always thought that they were only here to work in the agricultural field, in other words, on the plantations, the sugar plantations. But apparently they were also here to work in the mines and on the railway, especially, which I
yes. There are many here that I'm reading which says license to go to diamond field, and so on. So that was clearly granted, and it was not just sugar farming; it was on the mines as well.
Okay, but the very thing that I want to make clear is that they were not actually slaves, but they were almost slaves. And are there stories of people wanting to stay and not allowing to stay after their contract or their indenture was passed? Because I see that only about 26% of Indians went back to India.
Yes, so the majority chose to stay, I think, and I think that was, as part of their contract, they could stay if they'd worked out their indenture.
Yeah, right. So in other words, I did read at some stage that, some people didn't get the money, so they couldn't go back.
Yes.
So was there some unfair practices there?
You're talking about a time in empire when the world was full of unfair practices.
True enough. So the fact that the British Empire was involved obviously made it easier for people from India to come, because they weren't only Indians coming at that stage, but the vast majority were apparently from India.
Yes.
But was it because, what was the situation in the empire at that stage? Was there lots of joblessness? I mean, did people suffer in India so that they could come here, or what was the situation?
Well, India had always a huge population, and there were always pockets of people or large swathes of people who lived lives that were unbearable under those circumstances, famines, unemployment, and the like, and they took advantage of these so-called opportunities.
Okay, so let's get back to the difference between the indentured laborers and then also the passenger Indians. So mainly the passenger Indians came from the northern part. Is that true?
Yes, largely.
Okay.
From Gujarat mainly.
And religion-wise, they were different?
A lot of the passenger Indians tended to be Muslim. The indentured laborers were a mixed Hindu, Muslim, Christian.
Yeah, okay. And Sikh, yeah.
Very few Sikhs,
Okay.
if any.
Okay, because once again, I don't always go on data or research that many people did, but apparently this was about 7 to 10% of the Indians that came here were either Muslim, Christian, or Sikhs. But they did have a good influence. And then we get obviously to maybe one of the most famous people, Gandhi.
Yes.
Why did he come? Why did he come? What was his situation?
Well, he was a young barrister who had gone to England to study law, became a barrister, and was obviously looking for work. Through his connections from Gujarat, where he came from, there were other Gujaratis in South Africa, merchants, some very wealthy, who had sought his counsel and his services as a lawyer, which he was qualified to do under the British Empire, and he came to South Africa to service his clients.
So basically one specific client or a group of clients?
As I understand it, I think it was one client initially.
Yes. And so he stayed here, and then can you talk about his life here for a while?
Well, as far as I know, he came here. He appeared for this council for this merchant. Gave him legal advice. Appeared for him, as I understand it, and then decided to stay on in South Africa because he was clearly fascinated by it, and his services appeared to be in demand by other merchants. Mm-hmm. And during the course of that, there's the famous incident where he boarded a train, bought a first-class ticket, and was thrown off the train in the first-class carriage, and that brought home to him the iniquities of the situation, the racial discrimination, and it marked the beginning of his journey to fight that sort of discrimination.
And he developed his whole philosophy of satyagraha, right?
Yes, and then he introspected about how to do so, and developed that philosophy of passive resistance, which is translated from the Sanskrit or Hindi satyagraha, which means passive resistance, and it was used by Gandhi and the people that he worked with to fight and to oppose the various laws that were unjustly imposed on Indians, the poll tax and the so-called black tax and various other statutes which were effectively made them into second-class citizens.
And was it successful? I mean, he practiced that both in India and in South Africa, didn't he?
Well, yes. It was successful in that it fired the imagination of people, and people joined in large numbers and openly courted jail, and it forced the government of the time and the authorities to take notice of what was going on, because they couldn't and it caught international attention too. So from that point of view, it succeeded. Did it succeed in changing a particular law here or there? Not necessarily, but it sowed the seeds of non-violent struggle in South Africa, which became a hallmark of the early days of struggle in South Africa, and bore fruit in many ways in the 1940s with the passive resistance campaign. Again, when Gandhi had long gone, and in the 50s, in the Defiance campaign, and the masses that were galvanized along passive resistance lines to fight the iniquities of the apartheid system and the like. So he was from that point of view, it sowed the seeds very successfully. My grandparents both knew Gandhi at the time, were office bearers with him in what was called the British Indian Association, and they went on to be stalwarts in the passive resistance struggle, serving time in jail along with him and the like, and basically with many others laid the foundation, the familiar foundation of passing this on from generation to generation, which resulted in the continuation of struggle. That struggle was particularly pertinent in influencing people in the African National Congress, which had started in the early days of the century, of that century, and was started off in quite a conservative way, to asking the authorities almost cap in hand for redress. But when the Indian struggle, which influenced many of them, they moved, if you like, from supplication to resistance, from resistance to revolt, and that was the trajectory.
So, but Gandhi actually started the Natal Indian Congress, didn't he?
Yes.
It's soon after he came here for the first time. I think it's about a year or something after he arrived here, and that then also led to the Transvaal and the Cape Indian Congresses, which then eventually also joined forces with the Socialist and the SACP, so that together, that whole struggle became one struggle, a united struggle of many places, of many groups rather.
Yeah.
And I think today also, we often say that part of who we are is based on Ubuntu and Satyagraha. Not that one sees much of that, but it like you said, he had a huge influence on the way people resisted unfair treatment and making people second-class citizens.
Yes.
But Gandhi, was he a Hindu or a Muslim?
Gandhi was a Hindu, high caste Brahmin Hindu.
And I think the other day I came across something that he refused to take off his turban, which was in a court case because they didn't want him to wear it. So I assumed from that he was quite high class. But how much influence did he have in South Africa today, as in the Hindu population?
Well, I think, as a politician, as a man of principle, who fired the cause of struggle in this country, who seeded it in many ways, who then went on to India, devoted his life to the struggle against the British Empire there, and was responsible, along with many others, in winning that first struggle against the British Empire, India being the first colony to win its independence. So from that point of view, Gandhi has always had a special place of pride in the hearts of South Africans. Were they along religious grounds? I don't think so necessarily. It was more on the pride of what he did, and as an Indian, that he was a Hindu was neither here nor there. Gandhi had always made a point of treating all religions equally.
Right. But today's Hindu population in South Africa is quite large. I think the combined population of Indians in South Africa is 2.5%, and a large contingent of those people are Hindus. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I don't know what the breakdown is now, but I imagine that I'm guessing, that's probably something of the order of 40% Muslim, 40% Hindu, and 20% Christian.
Okay, right. But yes, now let's get back to how the South African Indians actually still practice their culture. Is it much different? I know that some people say the accents are different, when they speak Gujarati, whatever. The food obviously is different, but is there anything that you can mention that makes South African Indians typical South African Indians?
Well, like all people who change countries and live here for over 100 years, or 160 odd years, local customs develop and are grafted onto their original customs. So the people would have brought with them their religion and modes of dress and ways of eating, but then the religion remained much the same, because religion is religion, and it's governed by scriptures and practice, and that is sort of universal. So, like a Christian from Germany practices that particular kind of Christianity in as much as a South African Christian of that denomination would. So that was the same in the various Indian religions. Dress, yes, they dressed according to the way they dressed in India, and took pride, particularly on special occasions, by dressing in that particular way. But of course, the local Western customs of dress also took hold, and they had a sort of dual wardrobe, if you like.
Okay, but for traditional festivals, they still wear their traditional.
Yes, and food as well. While they began cooking, it's obviously influenced by the kind of agricultural and other produce that was available, and that tempered the way they cooked and the availability of spices, and developed its own particular niche and flavor.
Oh, I mean, and in Durban being one of the largest Indian populations outside of India, obviously developed the Bani Chow, which I don't think is a typical Indian thing, but it's a typical Durban Indian thing.
Yes, that sort of thing. So you'll find similarities in Indian cooking between Gujaratis, say here, and Gujaratis in India, between South Indians here and South Indians in India. But there are departures which have been localized, as you say, Bani Chow and the like.
Exactly. Yeah. Just getting back to Gandhi briefly, I was just thinking about what you said just now, that he was fighting the British Empire, but in the South African War, or the Second Freedom War, as Anglo-Boer War, some people still call it, he was actually on the side of the British.
Well, he wasn't. He was an ambulance bearer. Mm. So he provided medical corps and humanitarian assistance. Initially, Gandhi's view was that he recognized the sovereignty of the British Crown and Empire, and sought redress within the confines of empire for Indian people to be treated like others on the same grounds that British people were treated. Of course, this was not granted, and he then broke with his faith, if you like, in the British Empire, to be even-handed and across the board.
So yeah, like I also thought that because of his Hindu religion, he was against violence, and I thought that was why he opted to become an ambulance. What do you call those bearers? Ambulanceman, basically.
Well, the Hindu religion is not necessarily against violence. I mean, he developed a passive resistance ideology, and an ideology that was non-violent, and a practice that was non-violent. I mean, if you go back in history, in India, Hindu rulers, Muslim rulers, Sikh rulers, all fought each other quite viciously.
You're right. Yeah, one forgets that basically. Let's just get. So, did you know Gandhi personally?
No, I was far.
Your grandparents did, right?
My grandparents did, and my father met him.
Your father did. Okay.
Yeah.
So coming back to your father,
my uncle, one of my father's brothers, Ali, lived with Gandhi on what was called Tolstoy Farm here, which Gandhi lived on, where he practiced and developed lots of his philosophy of resistance and way of life.
Just a quick question. He was married, wasn't he?
He was married and had children who some lived here and grandchildren lived here and others in India.
Yep, I'm sure that somebody the other day mentioned that they wanted to work on a tour of the Gandhi residences and the places of interest in South Africa. So let's hope that's going to happen as well. But getting back to more modern day people, there were lots, and there still are, lots of Indian politicians and activists, and your parents fall into that category.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about them?
Well, as I said, my grandparents came to this country. They were successful merchants. They lost a lot of their businesses because of their political struggle that they got involved with. When they went to jail, their businesses suffered, and the like. Their offspring then carried that sort of
the flame of resistance.
Of resistance, if you like, forward. And my maternal uncle was an early activist and president of the Transvaal Indian Congress. My father became secretary of the South African Indian Congress. My father, Gandhi's two lieutenants in this country, both successive chairmen of the British Indian Association, of which Gandhi was secretary, was my maternal and paternal grandfathers. So those two families were united both in struggle but also in marriage, by the marriage between my mother and father, and that was passing of another baton in the struggle going forward.
So, in other words, there was lots of jail time. There were house arrests and all kinds with people. But your mother was also quite active in the march in the 1950s for the women's march. Yeah,
my mother began as a very young activist, in her teens, really. Her sister was very active in the passive resistance struggle of the 40s and later on, and my mother followed in her footsteps, and then became a fully fledged activist in the struggle for freedom of this country, and organized women in particular, socially, economically, politically, and in 1956, when the march took place, she was one of the leaders of the march. But because she was pregnant with me, so I was
the only male.
Perhaps the only male on the march, apart from the policeman. But she wasn't. Her doctor forbade her to march, so she had to be driven up in parallel and arrived later, but was together with Lillian Ngoy, Helen Joseph, Rahima Musa, Sophie de Bruyn. My mother was one of the leaders.
Mm-hmm. Just your mother's name, before we forget that, Amina, right? Amina.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And your father was more the intellectual, but he was also active in the struggle.
Yes, yes. He was, as I say, secretary of the South African Indian Congress, and house arrested and banned for many, many years, went to jail, and was in many ways one of the architects of the Defiance campaign, of the Congress of the People. He and Walter Sisulu were the joint secretaries of the Defiance campaign. So his time of activity, particularly in the 1950s, was very significant. Remember that in the 1960s there was a huge clampdown on political activity, starting with the state of emergency in 1960, and the 60s saw the political activity being driven underground. So there was not, it was either underground or it was forced abroad, and that's when the ANC went abroad and set up missions outside. And my father remained here and was banned and house arrested in that time.
And before I ask you the final question, I just wanted to say that there are today still a lot of Indians that are activists and very sort of public activists. And there are people in parliament. There are, I mean, we think of Kader Asmal, who was there, Ahmed Katrada, of course, lots of people that were very prominent in our first government, in our first parliament. And today still, there are some young Indian people that are part of parliament, aren't there?
Yes, yes. And,
you're one of them. You're one of them, and there are others as well.
Yes, no, there certainly are. In across the board, in the IFP, in the ANC, in the DA, even in the smaller parties like the NFP and the like, you'll find contributions and the presence of Indians.
Mm-hmm. And well, not only politicians and activists, but also in sport. Yes, and then also obviously broadcasters, producers, actors, doctors. I mean, obviously all professional people. So the influence is big, although there's, like I said, not a huge percentage of Indians in South Africa, or rather, if you compare it to the rest of the population. Now, personally, do you think that all the struggle that went on, Gandhi's influence, whatever, has bode well for what is today the South African Indian?
Yes, I think it gave the South African Indian a very clear sense of purpose and a very firm footing, that they were that many of them were steeped in the struggle and sacrificed, and if you like, earned their place in society, and as South Africans who contributed in no small way, despite the smallness of their time, of their numbers, to much that has resulted in getting us to that pivotal point in 1994 when we enshrined a new democracy.
It's often said that Indian parents have almost an obsession to get their children educated well. Would you say that is still true?
Yes, I mean, I think that's true, and particularly in immigrant communities. The original people came over as with very little education. They were laborers. Others were businessmen and shopkeepers. And as soon as they made a little bit of money, they saved their money, and they did what immigrants do, not unlike the Jewish people, who said, right, now you must become a doctor and you must become a lawyer. And that's how they began pushing their children into areas of education.
And just the last question: do you think that the passage Indians and passenger Indians, I never know which one it is, passenger Indians and the indentured laborers, was there ever any clash of interest, or was there any ill feelings between the two groups, or did they merge quite well?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, I think there were obvious discrepancies in terms of class, but many of the indentured laborers who won their freedom and continued from indenture and stayed in the province of Natal and continued to work there. Obviously, many worked for other Indians, for passenger Indians in particular, who had established businesses and were able to employ other Indians, which they did because of the familiarity and the so-called and the trust that they had in them.
It's also interesting, you know. I was just this. We were just in the previous session spoke about a very prominent Indian slave that arrived in Jan van Riebeeck's time, Peninsula van Ghaleb. So I mean, it was there was not, before the indentured laborers, there were already quite a lot of Indian slaves.
Yes, well, that was in the Cape.
Exactly.
And in the Cape, in that time, slaves were brought in from the east, from various parts of the east, from parts of southern India, from Java, from Batavia, from all those places there, and there were Indians amongst them who were brought in the late 1600s.
That's right. So I was always wondering, you know, when there was this gap between the slaves, Indians, and then the indentured laborers. So there were hundreds of years actually between them. But it seems as if, you know, there is no distinction at the moment of, you know, you were a slave and you were an indentured laborer, whatever. So is there a firm feeling of oneness or belonging in the Indian community in South Africa?
Yes, there is. But like all communities, you know, there are differences on geographical differences, religious differences, which bring in some cultural differences. So yes, you'll find even amongst the Hindu community, there's a separation, if you like, culturally and in the way certain parts of the religion are practiced between the South Indian Hindus and the North Indian Hindus. Then of course there are differences between them and the Muslims and the Christians who come from a long line of Christianity in India dating back to St. Francis.
But I mean, this is all very interesting. But do you say there definitely is a sense of belonging, but obviously also embracing the differences, you know, in the different groupings?
Yeah. And the common struggle welded them together. The bonds were forged in struggle. When you were thrown into jail, didn't ask you whether you want to go into a separate jail because you were Hindu or Muslim. You were all thrown in together.
Exactly.
And that's how the bonds began. Also, when the indigenous people in Natal, the Zulus, rioted in 1949 and attacked the Indian population, physically murdering many of them, men, women, and children. They didn't ask whether they were Muslims or Hindus. They were Indians, and that also bonded them together.
Well, this was something that I didn't quite realize, but yeah, maybe in the later talk we can talk about that. But that is something that I didn't know, this specific struggle, or battle that there was, or war that there was.
Yeah, it was the riots of 49 when the Zulus attacked Indians. There were horrific stories of babies being speared with assegais, and it was too terrible.
Oh, yeah, well, let's not dwell on that too much, but at least we can at a later stage maybe look at some of those stories. Ghaleb, thank you very, very much for giving us your time. And yeah, we will talk later about other topics.